Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the fabulous Suzie Welsh. Now, Suzie is the Group Chief People Officer at ODEON Cinemas Group. She's also a member of our Dial Global Advisory Board, so particularly pleased to have her here with us today. Now, Suzie took the role on as Chief People Officer in July of 2017, impressed by the focus and passion for people and experiences across the group. She spent her career driving successful people strategies in the hospitality and leisure sector, most recently, prior to this role, as Group Chief People Director for Pizza Express Group. She led the People First strategy and is going on to do the same at ODEON. So very excited to see all the fantastic work that she's been doing across the board with people and also diversity and inclusion and belonging. Prior to that, Suzie's worked for nearly 2 decades in a variety of roles across the board, from Whitbread PLC through to TGI Fridays and Costa Coffee. Welcome to the show, Suzie.
Hello.
Hello, welcome. It's so great to have you finally here, because I know that we obviously speak a lot and you're on our advisory board, which is wonderful, but it's the first time we're doing a podcast, so it's very exciting indeed.
It's a little bit weird, but very exciting, yeah.
It is a little bit weird, and I'm more nervous today. Actually, I'm never nervous, but because it is someone who I feel very close to, and obviously we heed your advice a lot on a frequent basis about other matters. It is slightly weird. But Suzie, for those who perhaps don't know you as well as I am fortunate to do so, I wonder whether you could give us a brief synopsis of how you came to be where you are today for our listeners who are at home or in the office, wherever they may be today.
So I have grown up in hospitality, right from kind of part-time jobs while I was at school and university, and loved it so much. Loved that kind of interaction with guests, and particularly from a hospitality perspective, you get to put a smile on someone's face, and I loved that aspect. So I started in operations, moved into HR, and worked my way through from restaurants into coffee shops, back into restaurants for a bit, and now into cinema. So I feel like I've kind of done a good spectrum of different roles, but always in hospitality and leisure, and I absolutely love that.
Fantastic, because you studied that at university as well, and without me prying too much into your background, I mean, you really have had fantastic career, and perhaps wanted to do hospitality and work in this industry from when you obviously went through education and such like. But did you envisage when you were, because I noticed you were at girls' school as well, which was really interesting. I thought I must ask Suzie about that on the podcast. But talk to me a little bit about the decision-making process and how you ended up going on this career path from when you were younger.
So hospitality wasn't necessarily where it started. So I did theatre studies at A-level and at GCSE, and actually that's where I wanted to go. So I wanted to move into the theatre, particularly quite a lot of the backstage kind of creative elements of it, albeit I'd done some acting as well. And then had my dad ringing in my ears going, you can have a job 10% of the time, Suzie, or you can have a job 100% of the time. Which would you like? And I started working part-time in a bar and loved the fact that actually the skills were relatively transferable, and the ability to kind of almost be on a stage in a slightly different way, but there was also a creativity to it, led me down that path really. So I ended up doing that in a year out, and then into university to study it, and then out into a variety of roles and so on, and I absolutely adore it.
That is so fascinating. I can't believe that I never knew that as well, that you did some acting. I'm going to have to ask you about that. Because I also wanted to do that, unbelievably. I remember auditioning for Harry Potter when I was 16, and God knows what happened then after that, but I can't believe it, because I could see you in acting.
So yeah, it's my night. I love that kind of side of it, but I definitely needed the kind of structure that you get, I think, being in a in a shift-based role, and I needed to know that I'd got things coming in. I definitely wasn't confident enough to step in. So it was the right decision for me, having spent quite a lot of my school life working my way up to that point. So yeah, I came out in a good place. So it's worked well.
Very good. And so, to a degree, it was kind of quite serendipitous, really. You know, the fact that you worked in a bar, and I think, you know, lots of us when we're young have jobs. And remember our waitressing and our kind of our bar
Yeah.
jobs. I'm worked at Pizza Express, in fact. I think I've told you before, and then at Starbucks, and you know, they're really kind of fond memories, actually. And you know, I guess, you know, was it kind of that enjoyment, you know, whether it be from kind of working in the bar and some of the experiences you had when you were younger, perhaps made you then go down that route, because of course you studied hospitality and management at university, I believe.
Yeah, so I think the bar bit definitely helps. That being in that shift, kind of doing shift work, you kind of build your own little social network because you work such different hours to everybody, and I loved that sociability that comes with it. In university, so university for me was definitely a tick box exercise. Definitely, I could have carried on quite happily without going, but it felt like I needed to have that thing on my CV. I wouldn't do it now, interestingly. So if I could go back, it's not the path I would have taken. I would have done an apprenticeship without a doubt. So I would have changed how I got my qualifications. But then it became very easy to kind of step into roles and kind of that management piece, and being able to lead shifts and kind of work with teams was a huge part of moving forward. And then that kind of pushed me into HR, and actually specifically into training. So I ended up doing a lot of operational training during part-time roles and then into full-time roles, and that was kind of my start into HR, really, was training people in opening new restaurants and kind of building that bit, and that then became my career path. So HR wasn't necessarily where I thought I'd end up. I thought I'd be in operations.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And it's interesting as well that you say that you go back and do an apprenticeship. I think, you know, I mean, there's so many fantastic opportunities now for youngsters and apprenticeship programs where you don't necessarily these days kind of end up with perhaps a huge mountain of debt, and you have that real great hands-on experience. And so, and I can see you, well, I know how passionate you are about people, so I can see you, picture you absolutely flourishing in a role like that in the kind of, you know, in the early days. And I mean, it would be remiss of me kind of not to perhaps ask about how things have been going recently as well. And of course, we are all living in these unprecedented times, as we keep hearing at present, and we're both working at home right now. I can see obviously the wonders of being able to see into someone's house, as is you know, the brilliance of Zoom and Teams and what have you. But how have you been finding things of late, and how have you been managing yourself through these recent times?
Okay, so I think trying to get family sorted, and both my husband and I are working at home, so one's on the kitchen table, and luckily I managed to kind of get our studies, so he's on the kitchen table at the moment, and our two kids are at school. But it's been balanced okay. Kids have been absolutely amazing, which I think has helped, and just got on with it and found their way through. So that has, I think, eased all of the other things. I think the reality of ending up being quite busy through work has meant that being at home and the reality of what's going on probably hasn't hit in the way it might have done for others. So it's been a very different experience. But I've ended up, I suppose, being in a place of finding the good bits. I think you've got to search for them and keep some level of focus, but appreciate that everybody feels something different at different points during this process, and it is tough. It's really tough. But for me personally, it's been okay. We found our way through, and I think that's all you can kind of ask for at the moment.
And this is absolutely you in a nutshell, if you don't mind me saying, is always look at the glass half full and look at the positive things that come out of this. And indeed, you know, I think it is an opportunity perhaps for people and organisations to be able to reflect. And perhaps to use some of the time to be creative and innovative, which is one of the things that I know that you're incredibly passionate about. Not only being creative and thinking of new ideas to be able to engage people, but of course you're massively passionate about diversity and inclusion and belonging, and all of those pieces that involve people and really kind of putting people and engagement at the heart of things. So no wonder, because now I know you've built a whole number of big strategic plans, people focused, engaging people, you know, from your work at Pizza Express and obviously now onto ODEON. I wonder whether you could kind of talk us through some of the pieces that you have been working on. And you know, I think you've been doing some podcasts and kind of internal other creative ideas to be able to really shine a light on voices within the organization, because it's quite easy for people whilst they are at home perhaps to be feeling lonely, or perhaps feeling that they are not connected anymore with the outside world. And so really making sure that we do drive forward within our organizations and keep speaking, keep being transparent, keep everyone together collectively, ultimately.
Yeah, it's been really interesting actually, and I've learned loads over the last few months. I think I've not been in ODEON that long, so I kind of still feel like the new girl. It's only been since last July, and so you end up in quite an interesting place of still trying to gauge what the culture's like, and then to have something like this happen where suddenly your workforce is at home, some working, some not working, and you have to think really carefully about how you keep some level of normality and some level of culture and tone of voice there, but know when to dial it up and dial it down in the best possible way. And we've worked quite hard at that actually. And there's an amazing people team that sit alongside me, and an amazing senior leadership team in ODEON Cinemas Group, who kind of come together, and we operate across 12 countries. So we're having to kind of juggle that cultural change, and actually the rules and what the impact is very different in each of the countries we operate. But we spent a lot of time being open and transparent and talking to people like they're adults, and not kind of trying to hide things or put a spin on things, but also thinking about where we're best placed to support people in the right way and allowing people some space to do what they need to do as well. So in the UK, we have a campaign called Be Well. It's a program around health and well-being, and it has lots of different strands to it. And the team have one of the strands that they've brought in is one called Be Curious. So they've now given the UK team a platform to develop and learn and interact with each other. And it's had just an amazing reaction to it in terms of how people have taken part and are sharing, whether it be cooking, or it might be a leadership development book, or they might be doing some art or whatever it may be, but they're sharing almost these passions that they have that they just wouldn't do normally. I don't think they're all the good things for me that's come out, all those little bits that you wouldn't know. So we've done a lot of that, a lot of kind of health and well-being stuff in each of the countries to build those pieces. And then in the last 4 weeks, we've built a leadership academy online. So we use Workplace by Facebook as our platform, and so we've been adding elements of books and podcasts, and then we've done a few internal podcasts with some of our senior leaders to kind of build a library of material that people can spend some time going through and pick out the bits that are relevant to them. So everyone has their own development journey. It's different for each person, and therefore they can go and understand which bits might work for them. But it also helps us then work through what is going to be important for us coming out of this. Where will we need our leaders to step into spaces, and actually how do we develop them to be more comfortable in a world where we are going to have to be more agile, or resilience is going to play a bigger part in our day to day, if it hasn't already, that, you know, we've required that for the last 3 months. So it's really been about how we build some of those elements out.
I think that's absolutely fantastic, and to do that in such a short space of time as well. You know, some brilliant digital tools out there, like you say. What a great idea to be. I mean, of course, you know, I'm a massive fan of podcasts anyway, e-learning and everything like that. But I think the wonderful thing about that, when you talk about agile working, is actually people can dip in and out of what it is that they are passionate about. And as you allude to there, everyone is individual, everyone is on different phase of the leadership journey or D&I journey, career journey, etc., etc. And so actually being able to go in, and my guess is to be able to kind of look and search and see which pieces of information, which individuals, because obviously it's a huge organization that pretty much everyone knows the name of, and there's lots and lots of people involved. So actually, actually streaming that down into something where people can work flexibly, pop in and out in between meetings that are scheduled, do as they please, any device, any time, anywhere, it is absolutely lends itself to that agile way of learning and working, and ultimately being personally responsible for what you wish to get involved in.
But it wouldn't have been our first choice, and that's been the interesting piece for me, is if this situation hadn't occurred, there is no way we would have put that in place as our first kind of step into how we develop people from a leadership perspective. And in a normal world, even if we had decided that's what we wanted to do, we would have taken months crafting it, organizing it. It would have had a big launch. We didn't have any of that opportunity. So it's really made me think about how we do things in the future, and how often sometimes we spend so much time, and this is a piece for me, perfecting something and making sure it's exactly right. How much time do you lose, and how much opportunity do you lose in terms of how you interact with people, because you spend too much time crafting and you don't live and learn as you go through, which is way more impactful.
Absolutely. I mean, you're completely right. It's expedited the entrepreneurial way of working ultimately. And I mean, what's interesting, you read the management books and business books and things like this, and people talk about culture change. And I love to talk about culture change, but really, never has there been a time where things are forced to happen quite so quickly, as you say. But clearly, I know how positive a person you are. It's a case of looking at this as being kind of glass half full, really. And actually, what a great way to bring everyone together virtually, to be able to share their thoughts and ideas, because ultimately no one has a glass ball right now. Even I was talking to CEOs of kind of Ipsos and Ipsos Mori, and they are a market insight organization, and they're saying, look, we are going to potentially feel effects till 2022, and we don't have a crystal ball, and everyone's asking what's going to happen. But where you can have that openness and that transparency, and bringing together your leaders in a collective way to share ideas and best practice, ultimately it is that diversity of thought that harnesses the power of potentially more creative thinking, as you guys and girls have done.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. And Susie, I wonder as well, because, we started the conversation talking, kind of briefly about apprenticeships and things like this. And I know that is another passion project, if you will. You're passionate about the youth, you're passionate about mentoring. You've also been, up to this point, very passionate about making sure that not only women, but other individuals, diverse and inclusive across the board, of all the wealth of people on the spectrum, really do reach their potential and utilize, those mentoring and such like skills and the role modeling to be able to make sure people do reach their full potential. And I wonder whether you can talk through a little piece kind of around, some of the mentoring work you've done, whether it be here at ODEON, whether it be kind of in the past, because, I truly believe where we are in this kind of this intergenerational world almost, and, the vast majority of our workforce these days is pretty much millennials and zillennials. And, it is fascinating to see how different those leaders of the future could be in relation to, maybe slightly more kind of archetypal or slightly more seasoned leaders, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think mentoring has been a huge part, and particularly in the last couple of years, I've probably done more, specifically around women actually, but I find it hugely beneficial, and it is two-way. You do find that there's so much you get back from an experience perspective as I think others ask of you, and it does need that two-way piece to kind of have that openness of dialogue. But it's been really interesting to see, to a degree. I think there's the way that people talk about millennials is quite structured, and there's some quite strong opinions about who millennials are or not. And actually, when you get into it, not necessarily the case on all of those bits. And some of the things that I'd struggled with still are there. You know, they're not necessarily as confident in the way that potentially they're portrayed, or they're not necessarily as demanding in the same way. But there are little nuggets in terms of how you can bring it out. And I find some really interesting, you end up having some really interesting conversations alongside those bits about how you can kind of improve. I take lots of ideas back into what we need to do in the workplace. You know, our average workforce, the age of our workforce is kind of 20 to 25 in most of the countries we're in. So actually
Wow.
kind of helping to understand some of those thought processes is really useful. You know, things I might assume are right and just aren't. So it's really, really useful.
It is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned there kind of a piece around confidence. And I have to say, if you don't mind me saying so, and I know other people have said this about you when we've seen you do presentations in the past, you're so incredibly serene when you go about your presenting, and always seem incredibly confident. Have you always kind of been that way? Because
No.
and and because I personally, I mean, I just can't imagine it. I've said this to you before. I always say, you know, so, Susie, how do you? And I've said to you before, if I'm presenting or it's been a dinner or whatever we're doing, you know, I'm feeling nervous before talking, what have you. But you have this real kind of serene calmness about you and your personality. And you mentioned there, you know, especially linking into kind of some of the mentoring pieces and the role model pieces, is I think the perception often of leaders is that they are confident, they're in a senior position, they can't be shaken, they aren't necessarily vulnerable. But I don't think, it's not always necessarily true, is it?
I think it's hardly ever true. I think for most there's a whole background of stuff that sits there, and most people work really, really hard, I think, to do the best they can. So they don't want to disappoint. They have a responsibility. So whether it's people doing presentations, you feel a responsibility when you've been asked to do something that you want to give it your best. And I think a lot of hard work happens behind the scenes. And that'll be the same for you as it is for many others. You work really hard so that when you're delivering it's right. I think, I mean, there's so much to be said for being able to kind of come out and say, this is hard. My confidence, I think, is probably more there than it was. And if you spoke to my old bosses from 10 years ago, I think I found my voice quite late on, but it takes time. And I have days where I'm like, I'm definitely not good enough to do what I do. And how someone's going to find me out soon. And how am I playing this, you know, and what happens next? You have those moments, but I think that helps. So it helps kind of drive and allow me to kind of hopefully do some good things. But it doesn't always work out like that. And I feel sick every time I stand up and do a presentation, whether that be to people I work with on a daily basis or in front of a massive conference. It doesn't go, but I think that helps me. I think that makes it important. It means something. I worry about the day if I don't feel it, that it doesn't mean I'm not passionate about it. So I use it for good, I suppose.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so articulately put, as always, and you absolutely would never tell from the outside. And I mean, it's fascinating. And you know, one of the things I absolutely love about doing this podcast, I must say, is interviewing very senior individuals like yourself and CEOs across the board, etc. And no, actually, that imposter syndrome is a very, very real thing. And I think with a lot of the mentoring that you do, you know, and probably why you're so good at it, is that transparency and that openness. And I think it is so important, especially for the future generations of leaders when it comes to kind of mentoring and role modeling and speaking to people and the youth about their confidence, is that leaders do share those vulnerabilities. Leaders are real people, and they have real emotions and have been through this before. And so, you know, I there's been many a time where I've interviewed people, you know, yourself included, and you think, wow, you know, it's just phenomenal that not only are leaders prepared to share their vulnerability, but also to say that, look, you know, and I think it takes more braveness and courage actually to say, look, you know, not necessarily perfect, but hey, I'm absolutely doing my best, because no one got to where they have got to without going through, probably what has been a serious emotional roller coaster, and a lot of people, like bosses that you say along the way, who have been supportive and have been role models in their own right, and so hopefully that ecosystem of mentoring, supporting, kindness, etc., goes round.
I hope so. Yeah, I think everyone will go through something, and how you use it is quite key. I think but everyone will go on that roller coaster.
Indeed. And before we run out of time for today, Susie, I'd love to go into the lightning round, if that's okay with you. That's a bit of fun for the end. And I know you've listened to the podcast before, so you know what's coming, hopefully. I'll try not to throw any difficult questions in there. But first and foremost, what does diversity, inclusion and belonging mean to you personally?
So for me, it is always about showing that there's difference around the room, and difference means a whole host of things, but it's about finding that difference to be able to make a difference, actually. So I believe the two go hand in hand. More importantly than that, that difference has to have equal voice, and how you bring that voice to life, I think, is quite key. It's one thing to have difference in the room, it's another one to ensure that there's equality in the room as well. And that kind of builds the belonging piece for me, which we've had many chats about how important the belonging element is.
Absolutely. I don't know whether you meant to do that there, but that is such a great strap line, by the way, finding a difference to make the difference. That is brilliant. We should absolutely use that for something. That is brilliant. And I wonder what is, and again, perhaps it feeds into the last question somewhat, but what is authentic leadership to you, Susie?
So I find the things that I connect with is that kind of humility and authenticity. So somebody who's real, somebody who is prepared to be vulnerable, step out and say how they feel and share that. And then also, I've learned more and more how it makes me feel when I feel like I've got an equal voice in the room to everybody else, and therefore having a leader or a line manager who can bring that to life, I think is quite key, and really listen to what's going on.
Absolutely. 2 ears and 1 mouth, as they say.
Absolutely.
And who has inspired you the most throughout your life, or indeed your career? It could be personal, could be professional.
So loads of people, and I'm quite keen to find a learning in everything, and kind of build, and from different people as well. So some of those people that I haven't got on that well with, or haven't connected with, what can I learn? It will be cliche to say my parents, but I think kindness is quite important to me, and it's quite a buzzword at the moment, but I think it's quite an important part of my leadership, and they've definitely shared and shown me how that really comes to life in terms of how they operate. But I've had line managers who have helped me, show me what it's like to be confident, but not when you're an extrovert. I'm not an extrovert. I'm an introvert. I like my own space. I'm never the first person to talk. That's my character, and therefore to find people who are introverted, who can kind of show you and inspire you to feel like you can step into a room in the right way, I think has been hugely beneficial to me. So I've got a number of line managers who've done that, but absolutely my parents have kind of helped develop a lovely kindness element to me, hopefully.
Not hopefully, definitely. Thanks so much for sharing, Susie. That's a great answer. And I wonder who, if any, have you any favourite heroes or sheroes, or even books or authors or films? I'm sure you'll have a massive list here, because of course, being in the ODEON, I'm sure there's plenty that you could list off. But are there any particular that stand out for you?
So I have 2 film posters at work that are my kind of films. So one of them is Captain Marvel. So she is my feminine kind of Marvel character hero. And then there's a film called Inside Out, which is a Disney film, which is all about emotions and memories, and how you build your memory bank, and how that helps you, how that kind of brings you to life. But my quote that lasted a long time with me when I was in Costa: all you need is faith and trust and a bit of pixie dust, which is Tinkerbell. So Tinkerbell has always been my hero. So films have kind of stayed with me a little bit actually as I've gone through my career. But she was she was quoted a lot when we were building people plans and working through things. So yeah, she sits at the top, Tinkerbell.
I love it. Yes, Tinkerbell. And I've not seen that film Inside Out now as well. I'll have to put that into the show notes, and I'm writing it down as you're speaking. So it sounds a great one to watch. And finally, I wonder if you could go back in time and give the young Susie advice. Perhaps it's around about the time when you're thinking about what to or not to study. Especially as you'd mentioned that earlier on in the interview. But I wonder, is there any advice that you would give to your younger self, or indeed someone else who's at a similar phase of their life and considering what they will do next?
So probably a bit later on than when I was studying, but I talked about finding a voice, and I think for me that would be it. I think it's be confident enough to talk and to speak out and give your opinion and use that for good. But I think it took me a long time to learn to be confident that I had an opinion that was worthy of sharing. So I think that would be my piece to my younger self.
Thanks so much, Susie. Honestly, it's been it's been a joy, as always, speaking to you anyway, but it's been a joy having you specifically on this show. And there's been so many great learning pieces, not only for me, but I'm sure for many people who are listening in here. A couple of the key pieces I've written down, and again, I will put these all into the show notes, but a couple of the key pieces for me are actually around not only the vulnerability, but also the being an introverted leader. I absolutely, that resonates with me a lot. I think a lot of people think that I'm extrovert, and it isn't actually true. But I think there's many individuals out there who have got aspirations to do bigger and better things and to want to learn. And I think you're an absolute role model. And this goes to everyone who is listening, anyone who's struggling to find their voice. Susie's an absolute proof in the pudding that you can be introverted and still have your voice heard and still make it to a group chief people officer role at board and at C-suite. And I think, confidence is something that has been almost interwoven throughout the podcast, interestingly. The podcast, the kindness, the transparency and the vulnerability. And I think, interestingly, vulnerability, again, whilst it is, and also perhaps a buzzword at the moment, I think is something that really is absolutely key to engagement, clearly. And actually the leaders of the future, and we talked a lot about millennials during the podcast today, is actually leaders of the future, those millennials, those zillennials, want to hear from real people and real voices, and they don't just want to hear that everything is absolutely perfect. Absolutely is not authentic. And so hearing from real models, and also almost more than role models, I think is critical. But there's been some brilliant quotes as well, which I'm going to re-quote you back here, because I think they're absolutely brilliant. But the finding a difference to make a difference, that's just absolutely brilliant. I'm 100% going to use that again, re-quote you, Susie. But also the Tinkerbell piece as well, actually having that faith and that trust. And could that ever be more important than right now? I don't think so. I think it's absolutely critical to right now. And finally, just trying to make sure that you listen to the inner voice and you try and externalize that, because everyone has imposter syndrome. I absolutely believe it to be true. And so for anyone who's listening in, who perhaps is struggling to find their voice, really do try and find people around you, as Susie has done throughout her career, who can be real models to you. Leaders who aren't necessarily archetypal, standing on tables, shouting from the tops of their voices. Actually, some of the very best leaders, the ones that are a little more understated, that listen intently, and actually, before you know it, have turned the world around and made a huge difference. And you don't know how it's all of a sudden happened so quickly. And so I think there's an awful lot that all of us can learn from this. So thank you very much, Susie.
Thank you.
You can check out all of the show notes from today's podcast. If you've missed anything at all, if you missed some of those great suggestions when it comes to films, then we will put all those into the show notes at the end of today's show. So don't worry at all if you didn't manage to write it down in time. Visit www.dialglobal.org/podcast, and we will look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.